All right, we are going to be starting chapter 14. This is a very large, hefty chapter because we're going to be covering psychological disorders, which, as you can imagine, is a very broad topic, and we have a lot of stuff to cover before we even begin to discuss specific disorders. So, in our first section, we're going to be talking about what is considered to be an abnormal behavior. We're going to be looking at how we define abnormal behavior and how that then is defined as a disorder. We're looking at the causes and rates of disorders, and then what also causes, how we conceptualize the causes of these disorders. So some important terms for you guys to understand. The first one is psychopathology. That's the scientific study of mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders. This term is used to refer to any sort of maladaptive behavior. And so psychopathology is this general area of study that we're going to be focusing on in this chapter. It's pretty much looking at any mental health disorder, behavioral disorder, emotional disorders. It's a very, very broad topic. Within this, we're going to be talking about statistical abnormality. So that is an abnormality defined on the basis of an extreme score on some dimension. This could be IQ, anxiety, depression, schizophrenia. So we all kind of fall within a normal range with most things going on in our behavior. But for some individuals, it ekes really high or really low, and that would be what we consider to be statistically abnormal. So if you remember back to our intelligence chapter, chapter 9, we had that bell curve where we saw most people kind of fall between 85 and 130 on an IQ score or IQ test, but some people fall lower and some people fall higher. And the same thing happens with mental health disorders. And then social nonconformity is the failure to conform to societal norms or the usual minimum standards for social conduct. And so we have different norms within each society that kind of defines what we consider to be typical. So for an example, being pierced. If you have a handful of piercings, maybe, 2 ear piercings, maybe a few more, maybe 1 or 2 in your lip, 1 or 2 in your eyebrow, your nose. If you have, a handful of piercings, no one's really going to bat an eye at it. But if, your entire face is covered with piercings, you have piercings all over your body, that would be kind of part of the social nonconformity. Being a prostitute in some cultures, that may not be considered to be a problem or something that is non-conforming, but obviously in our society that becomes socially problematic. We don't consider to be social nonconformity to be a psychopathological trait. It's not until we reach some other definitions. We'll talk about those on the next slide. And it's really the context that's important. So wearing pajamas when you're at home is not considered to be a problem. But if you start wearing them to work, and especially if you work in a formal office, like if your parents are lawyers and they start wearing their pajamas to work, that would be social nonconformity, even though in certain contexts within that society, it's considered normal. So abnormal behavior is, again, not culturally accepted, not statistically common, but we only consider it to be a disorder when it begins to cause that individual, not someone else, but that individual distress, and it causes them dysfunction. So if it causes them distress, so if a person, like these gentlemen here, are very heavily pierced and they're heavily tattooed, if it caused them distress, like they had a compulsion where they couldn't stop themselves from getting more piercings, and it caused dysfunction because they couldn't afford maybe basic life necessities because they were so busy putting all their money towards their tattoos and their piercings, or it was causing them health problems, that would be dysfunction. And that's when it goes from just being social nonconformity and maybe something that's statistically abnormal to something that is a disordered thinking process. So this is where we go into maladaptive behaviors. So these are behaviors arising from an underlying psychological or biological dysfunction that makes it difficult to adapt to the environment and meet the demands of day-to-day life. So this is when a person may lose control of their thoughts, their behaviors, their feelings. So as an example, gambling might be something fun that a person does. Maybe they go to the casino on the weekends. They spend a couple $100. For them, it's not a big deal. But if it becomes compulsive, they can't stop themselves from gambling, or they're unable to maybe pay for their rent or their food or pay for their children's activities. That would be when it becomes compulsive, and that is problematic. Same thing with collecting. I'm sure most of you guys have a collection of some sort that you've had for years, and collecting isn't a problem until it becomes hoarding and it begins to harm a person's health. So you probably have seen on TV people who have like Disney collections or McDonald's collections or Elvis collections, and their entire house is covered with memorabilia. But that's considered to be kind of strange, but within the realms of normality. But when they have so much stuff and so much clutter that they can't keep their house clean, that they are having trouble affording, their necessities because they're so busy buying memorabilia, or their house becomes dysfunctional and they can't move around it. That's when it's considered hoarding, and that's when collecting becomes maladaptive. So abnormal behavior in the law. So a lot of people have heard or use the term insanity. Say, oh, that person's insane. That's actually not a psychological term. That is a legal term, and that refers to a mental inability to manage one's own affairs or be aware of the consequences of one's actions. In order to claim an insanity defense in a trial, say like, someone murdered another person and they claim that they were insane at the time of the murder, they would need expert witnesses to state that they were indeed insane at that time and they were unable to understand the consequences of one's actions. It doesn't mean that they get off. They just get to go home and resume their daily life. They're typically involuntarily committed to some sort of mental health facility for a long-term treatment. There's the insanity defense. So that's someone who's accused of a crime and they state that they were unable to realize that what he or she did was wrong due to a diagnosable psychological disorder. And it has to be determined that they were unable to understand right from wrong. And obviously, depending on which psychologist you talk to, their views on this may change. And obviously, people who are trying to get out of crimes can lie, obviously. It's a very difficult plea or defense to actually use successfully. It's very rare that it's actually used successfully. And again, even if it is, it's not like they just get to go home and resume their lives. They were typically going to be committed to a facility for treatment. There's a really excellent book and movie about this from, I believe is the early 80s, or at least the movie is. It's called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The book is excellent. The movie is also excellent. It's got Jack Nicholson in it. I really highly recommend you watch it. It's rated R, but like early 1980s rated R, so it's not nearly as bad as like current rated R movies. So I think you should check that out. And if you would like to, I have a copy of the book. You're welcome to borrow it from me at any time. Just let me know. When we are looking at psychological disorders, we actually have what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This is shortly known as the DSM-5. This is essentially the manual that therapists, psychologists, anyone in the mental health community uses to help diagnose and treat patients. It's in its 5th edition, hence the 5. The last edition was published in 2013. It has lists of over 20 categories of disorders, and in total, it has over 300 different disorders in it. It takes an atheoretical approach, which means it's not like Freudian or like Rogerian, all these different like kind of techniques and approaches that people have taken over the years to help diagnose people. It's atheoretical, so it's just looking at symptoms, behaviors, and possible treatments, rates in general population. So it's a very good, clean manual. As it has been developed over the years, I think the first edition came out in the 1960s. It has continued to show improved reliability and validity as time has gone on. Obviously, the field of psychology has changed a lot, since the 1960s. Some notable changes is 1974, they removed homosexuality as a mental health disorder. Obviously, it was not a disorder, it's just a sexual orientation. But the psychological community up until that point, they really didn't know how to treat treat patients with homosexuality. They thought it was a disordered processing. And there are even changes happening now. Things like binge eating disorder was recently added. Or you probably have heard of Asperger's, that has now been folded into autism spectrum disorder, because it's just a milder form of the same condition, which is really interesting. Now, the DSM provides a list of standards, but it does not guarantee a correct diagnosis. Again, people can lie, people can not really understand their own thought process, which may make it harder for psychologists to make correct diagnoses. Different psychologists may see different things and diagnose it differently depending on how the patient is behaving or what their perspective is. Mental health disorders are difficult to diagnose. It's not like you can do a blood test and be like, oh, you have high blood pressure or you have schizophrenia. Like, it's not how that works. Even with today's technology looking at brain scans, we still can't look at a person's brain and be like, yep, borderline personality disorder. We're getting a little bit closer with that. We can see some changes in people's brains who have certain conditions, but that's not always a guarantee of a correct diagnosis. And so again, a mental health disorder is a significant impairment in psychological functioning. Now it says video here. I was trying to find a really good video that would explain the DSM and like its different parts and how it works. And I couldn't find that, but I found something much more hilarious. So check out the video DSM-5. It's hilarious. Also, there's an excellent crash course video that kind of goes over how we define mental health disorders and psychopathology. So excellent crash course video for you to check out. So we're going to be covering mental health disorders, and then that gets broken down further into neurodevelopmental disorders. These are psychopathologies in various forms due to damage to the nervous system before adulthood, autism being one, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, things like that. And then we have neurocognitive disorders, and these are psychopathologies due to various forms of damage to the nervous system not arising until adulthood, Alzheimer's being a very common one, or most addictive disorders. So neurocognitive disorders can be caused by damage to the brain, so poisoning by lead or mercury during prenatal development or early childhood. We've talked about teratogens before. Drug abuse, especially in prenatal periods. We also see old age, which causes deterioration. So these can be major disturbances in memory, judgment, personality. Alzheimer's disease we've talked about before. Again, that's characterized by memory loss, mental confusion, and then in its later stages, near total loss of mental abilities. Even things like swallowing, breathing, those basic reflexes get broken down because the brain doesn't have the functioning capacity anymore because of the proteins that get in between the neurons. There's a really great list in your textbook of the different disorders of categories. So psychotic disorders, we're going to be covering mood disorders, anxiety-related disorders, personality disorders. We're going to be talking about those in the next few sections. Feeding and eating disorders, we pretty much talked about already. Sleep-wake disorders, we've talked about. Sexual dysfunction, paraphilic disorders, substance abuse, and addictive disorders. And we're going to cover some of those that we've already covered before really quickly. So some overall rates, 57% of people in their lifetime, this is lifetime prevalence rates, will have a mental health disorder. That might be depression, anxiety. It could be related to a whole variety of different things. And it doesn't mean it's a permanent thing, especially if it's depression relating to grief or anxiety relating to a very stressful period of time in a person's life. It may be a temporary condition, but for other people, these mental health disorders are more chronic and long-lasting. The next, the most common type of mental health disorder is any substance abuse disorder. This could be alcoholism, gambling addiction, sex addiction. There's addictions to all kinds of different things, and I'm sure you guys understand that. Anxiety disorders are right behind that, about a third, and then mood disorders are about 21%. But schizophrenia and other psychoses are much more rare, even though I think you see them, kind of popularized in the media, and that's at about 0.4%, so less than half of a percent. Comorbidity, this is a really important term, and that's the simultaneous presence in a person of two or more mental health disorders. So 40% of people with a mental health disorder have another comorbid disorder. There's a lot of things that kind of like to pair up with each other. Obviously that's not a positive thing necessarily, but they do seem to kind of work with each other. So anxiety and depression are very common, or substance abuse in one area with another. So gambling with alcoholism, or substance abuse with schizophrenia. And so they oftentimes will come in pairs. And again, in about 40% of people, we see they have a comorbid disorder. When we look at the different types of disorders and how they affect men and women, you do see differences. So women in general have higher rates of depression disorders, which are considered mood disorders, or anxiety disorders. But men have higher rates of antisocial personality disorder, which is like what you consider to be psychopathology, sociopaths, things like that. And substance-related disorders are much higher in men than women. So where do these things come from? How does one develop a mental health disorder? Well, this is called the multi-path approach. This takes into consideration a variety of different dimensions that may affect your ability to withstand stress or biological predispositions. So the first part is biological. So you may be genetically predisposed to a mental health condition. Maybe you have a family history. So for example, I have a family history of bipolar disorder. Then we have epigenetics, so your experiences that may have affected your genetics and the way that your body reacts to things. So if you went through a lot of stress in your childhood, maybe you had your family got had a period of like homelessness, so that was a high period of stress for your family that could have caused stress reactivity differences. Brain anatomy, biochemical processes, as your neurotransmitters, how your central nervous system reacts, your autonomic nervous system, all that reactivity. So that's part of the biological dimension. Then we go to psychological. That is your personality, your way of thinking, your cognition, your emotions, how you've learned different things, and how you're learning kind of skills, your coping skills, your self-esteem, self-efficacy, values, early experiences. That's a big psychological dimension, and that is a lot, has a lot of foundation in your childhood with that. This is why teachers really focus a lot on self-efficacy, coping skills, cognition, learning. These are all the things that, teachers and parents can have a lot of influence on. Then we go to the social dimension. This is having family support or lack of family support, interpersonal relationships, social support, so having friends or larger community, feeling of belonging, love, marital status, and the general community that you live in. And then we go to sociocultural dimension. So race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, and culture. Obviously, especially in, America, different races are under more stress and have different experiences than people of other races, and same with gender, sexual orientation, religion. So if you have maybe some protective factors, so maybe you have low autonomic nervous system reactivity, you have good coping skills, high self-esteem, good self-efficacy, you have good family support, and you're in a fairly good socioeconomic status, even depending on your race and gender, you might be protected from something that you have a genetic predisposition for. But if one of those things kind of gets knocked out of place, maybe you're under stress because your sexual orientation isn't what our society deems to be correct or normal, that can set off a mental health disorder because of the additional stress that you're under. Now, when we look at how people have different behaviors, we can view it on a continuum from normal to disordered behaviors. So let's think about like your level of stress. This is, a nice example, or level of anxiety. So most of you guys are probably somewhere between mild to moderate. Like you're not experiencing no anxiety, like you're in this program. But maybe because you have some final projects coming up and, the stress of being at home, you're feeling more anxious, especially relating, with the things that are going on in the world right now. You may be kind of more on the moderately high area. But maybe once the summer comes, things calm down, you're going to be more in the normal range. But then at other times, you may go through a period of extreme stress. So maybe a family member gets sick and maybe they're hospitalized and you're having to do more at home. You may kind of bump up into this orange, less severe, but in a, diagnosable condition area. But then there could be periods of, very severe stress and anxiety, and that could bring you up into this red zone. And so this can change over time. Some people can kind of get stuck in one area on these higher levels. And this is where mental health people, counselors, clinicians can help out, medications can help out and help you either learn techniques, help your family learn techniques to help get you down into a safer area. And also medications, of course, can help you out as well. So this is I really like this. This is an example. It's not just like continuum to from normal to severe, especially when we're looking at more complex conditions. This is an example of autism spectrum disorder. And so some people are, mild in one area, so they may be mild in fixations, but they have maybe more abnormal or flat speech. Noise sensitivity is kind of moderate. Social difficulty might be high. Anxiety might be low. And so some people kind of fall not just on a continuum in one small factor or one disorder, but even within the same disorder, they may kind of fluctuate. So another example. So this is like, when people say like, oh, I'm high functioning autistic or low functioning, it's not necessarily high or low. It's just, you have different areas of what we consider to be, within the normal realm. And then, both people could be, high functioning, but just high functioning in different areas or low functioning in different areas. So I kind of liked this graphic as well as this one. So people have traditionally thought of, autism spectrum disorder as low to high functioning. But really it's like, here's, a bunch of different things and they're on this sliding scale, and, people can have different things and kind of where like their normal levels are set, but then stress might kind of bump one area up higher than another. So maybe like stimming might get higher during periods of high stress, but normally it's a little bit lower. And social cues might change, throughout a person's life. So kind of on a day-to-day basis, people can kind of check in and be like, okay, where am I falling within these different behaviors, and how does that make me feel, and what's going on in my life that might be affecting these? These are all really important things to kind of understand about oneself, whether you have a diagnosable mental health condition or not. Again, so the causes of disorders can be biological and organic. They could be psychological, they could be sociocultural, and they could be family factors. And again, some of these things can protect an individual, and some of these people can put a person more at risk for a mental health disorder. And then we can look at psychiatric labeling. So oftentimes people resist, parents, especially, they will resist having their child labeled with a mental health disorder. But the reason we use these is that as psychologists, we can facilitate our communication of human problems by having labels to help understand it. We can differentiate between what's normal and what's a clinical problem. We look at severity and duration. So, if you have anxiety, is it temporary? Is it just because you're stressed out with school? Or is it more chronic? Are you having anxiety during periods that don't really seem to make sense to you? It can be difficult, though, because once a person is experiencing a mental health condition, it can be hard to kind of figure out when things go back to normal. When does a person become sane? When do they stop exhibiting symptoms? And so the more normal you behave, sometimes the more strange that can seem. So there's a video about a classic experiment that a woman did, and then a man replicated it, decades later. Very interesting. And obviously, in today's society, mental illness is still highly stigmatized. People with mental health disorders are less likely to be hired. They're more likely to be denied housing, and they may have family and friends abandon them because they just don't understand it. I think things are getting better. I have been very I've been very happy to see that people are very open about their mental health conditions, especially in your generation and my generation. I have friends and I've had students who talk about, seeing their therapists and the great work that they're doing, and that, they're on medications and they're so helpful, or I'm making adjustments, or, this thing's going on in my life, so I have to adjust my meds. Like, that's all really important stuff to be open about. In the past, like, you never would talk about, oh, I had to go see my therapist, or I'm on drugs for depression or anxiety. Like, that was hugely stigmatized, and now it's considered normal. It's almost strange if you're not seeing someone regularly. So I am heartened to see that positive change in how people handle mental illnesses. I'm sorry, this graphic, it's kind of hard to read, but people oftentimes, especially traditionally, have thought of people with mental health disorders as being weak. But if you kind of put in the context of physical disorders, so if a person here has a fever, oh, I get you have food poisoning and all, but you could at least make an effort for the rest of us. Or I think if you just change your frame of mind, you'd probably feel better. Or have you tried, not having the flu? And so these are the things that people will say to people with mental health disorders. Well, why don't you just go for a walk? Being outside will, lessen your depression. Or why don't you just try to be happy? Or you have nothing to complain about. Why are you depressed? You have a great life. So people don't seem to understand that, just like your kidneys are an organ, or your liver is an organ, or your stomach's an organ, your brain is an organ. It can have organic problems. And again, they're harder to define because we can't just do a blood test or, do an ultrasound like, oh, you have a kidney stone. We can't do that with your brain, but it doesn't mean that it's any less real than any other physical illness that you may have. So before we go on to our major disorder categories, I'm just going to quickly go through some of the disorders that we've already touched upon in other chapters. So feeding and eating disorders, this came up in chapter 10. We talked about things like anorexia as well as bulimia. We didn't cover elimination disorders, but that kind of falls into the same category. So people who have difficulty controlling the elimination of their bodily waste, such as controlling their urination. We've talked about sleep-wake disorders back in chapter 5. So we talked about insomnia. We talked about sleep apnea. That's more of a physical disorder, though. Narcolepsy is probably another one you've heard of. That can be an individual who falls asleep just randomly throughout the day. Not just someone who's excessively tired, but like who will literally just fall asleep, or they go catatonic, meaning that they can't control their muscles and they freeze up or they collapse. I have an excellent video of a young woman who has narcolepsy, and she kind of has a video like that because she caught her in the act of having a narcoleptic episode. And that's in the playlist if you want to check that out. We talked about sexual dysfunctions in chapter 11. So we talk about problems with sexual desire, arousal, and response, gender dysphoria, paraphilic disorders. And then again, back in chapter 5, we talked about substance abuse disorders. We didn't really talk about disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders, but they kind of fall within that same area. But yeah, substance abuse we definitely covered back in chapter 5. So I'm going to stop here, and then we'll pick up in section 2, where we're going to be talking about psychotic disorders.